World War II transformed warfare, moving it from the trenches to the skies. The United States alone produced more than 300,000 planes by the war's end. This shift created a new and urgent need to identify recruits who were best suited to the specialties required of the Air Force, including pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and radio operators. At the outset of World War II, the U.S. Army interviewed candidates to identify prospective pilots. Those who failed to complete the flight program were enrolled in bombardier or navigator training. But this process was considered an inefficient use of time and resources. Psychologists responded to the call and created simple selection tests that could be administered to groups. This reliance on psychologists for the selection and classification of aircrew candidates was not adopted by the United States alone. Militaries around the world turned their focus to what psychological research could contribute to the war effort. Psychophysiological testing programs were adopted in France, Switzerland, England, Germany, and Italy. Among the Allied forces, exchanges of knowledge were common. One example of this cooperation is the collaboration between U.S. psychologists and French officials in the development of a psychophysiological selection and classification testing battery for potential French-speaking aircrew. When Germany invaded France in 1940, the French air forces were formally dissolved. The Allied liberation of Algeria and Morocco 2 years later provided the opening for the reactivation of the French air forces. Building on the international support, French cadets were sent to Allied countries for flight training. French researchers at the University of Algiers soon found themselves deeply embedded in the needs of the new French air forces. In response, the Medical Physiological Laboratory of French Aviation was founded towards the end of 1942. The laboratory was directed by Jean Malmaison, an experienced physiologist and flight surgeon who had fled on one of the last boats leaving an occupied Marseille only months before. The laboratory took on the task of researching and developing tests to select and classify French aircrew candidates. One member of the laboratory traveled to Randolph Field in Texas, where the Army Air Force's School of Aviation Medicine was developing tests for the U.S. candidate selection program. The U.S. provided details of their test battery, including the key characteristics believed to represent a good pilot, the data of candidates who had completed the program, and, most importantly, the test battery itself. Malmaison and his colleagues worked with this material to develop their own list of psychological traits that would define a good pilot within the French context. Malmaison's work reached a climax in 1944 when psychologist John C. Flanagan, a colonel in the U.S. Army Air Force's Psychology Division, shared the results of an aptitude test taken by French and U.S. candidates with members of the Joint Air Commission at the North African Theater of Operations. Flanagan reported a higher failure rate among French trainees and recommended that the selection and classification battery developed by U.S. psychologists be adapted for use by the French Air Forces. The request was soon made official, and the collaboration was approved within the week. The U.S. Army Air Forces selected 3 men to work with the French to translate the U.S. test battery. Leading the group was Major Philip H. Dubois, an American psychologist who had experience in military classification. Accompanying him were Technical Sergeant John Drost, a geologist, and Staff Sergeant Arthur Serf, a physician. All 3 were fluent in French. To prepare for the mission, Dubois visited 5 stations in Alabama where French trainees were already receiving flight training. It was here that Dubois first observed the differences between French and U.S. candidates. French candidates consistently scored lower than the U.S. candidates. Dubois suspected the language barrier was one possible explanation, but French candidates were also consistently scoring lower on the tests of mechanical comprehension and coordination, leading him to consider a difference in skills between the 2 countries. On April 26, 1944, Dubois, Drost, and Serf arrived in Algiers, armed with initial translations of the U.S. battery to begin their work with Malmaison and his team. The U.S. Army Air Force selection and classification battery consisted of both written and psychomotor tests. Written tests included general knowledge, reading, spatial orientation, math, and mechanical principles. The day ended with a biographical survey of each candidate's personal history and character. Next were the psychomotor tests, which included tests of finger dexterity, rotary pursuit, reaction time, 2-hand coordination, complex coordination, and rudder control. Each candidate received a series of scores that ranked their performance in relation to the different aircrew positions: pilot, bombardier, navigator, mechanic, and gunner. The international team began their work with the written tests, editing the literal translations to account for the cultural differences between the two countries. These changes included replacing the items on the general information test that focused on American sports or American aviation terminology with French equivalents. Adaptations to the reading comprehension test were more difficult as the team could not find an equivalent text in any French sources. When it came to the biographical data blank, more adjustments had to be made to represent the French educational system and French customs. With the instructions for the psychomotor tests, the texts had to be entirely rewritten. Unlike their U.S. counterparts, French candidates had no previous experience with these types of testing instruments, so the team needed to pay special attention to make sure the directions were clear. In the end, the French version of the battery allowed more attempts on the tests of finger dexterity and rotary pursuit to accommodate these differences in experience. Once the initial translations were complete, Dubois assisted Malmaison in directing the training of French staff to administer the new test battery. This role fell primarily to women from the newly established Force Féminine de l'Air, roughly the French equivalent to the Women's Army Corps in the U.S. In the first year of trials, 2,129 French Air Force candidates completed the translated tests. Malmaison and Dubois rated the results a success. While the trials represented only the first step for Malmaison and his team, the collaborative mission was considered complete, and Dubois, Droste, and Cerf returned to the United States. For the remainder of the war, Malmaison continued his research at the Selection Center in Algiers, adapting the translated psychophysiological testing battery so that it could be used in more ways to support personnel recruitment and reclassification. Additional selection centers were also established in other regions to expand this work among the French Air Forces. Meanwhile, in the United States, Dubois and Cerf continued their work with the French translation of the classification battery. They worked with French candidates who had been eliminated from the pilot program to reclassify them as bombardiers, navigators, or gunners. Over the course of the war, the U.S. selection and classification battery was translated not only for use by the French, but also for use with Chinese and Filipino aircrew trainees. These collaborations serve as a lasting example of the international cooperation and exchange of psychological research that took place during World War II. Many of the test batteries that were developed during this period would go on to serve as the models from which Air Force selection and classification procedures still draw from today.